This video is going to be on imposing, specifically a gang up imposition on command workstation. But really I wanted to start it in InDesign because making a good file to send over to the press can make a lot of difference for how we're going to impose it and how we're going to trim this and finish it as well. So I have my document here. It's all finished, ready to go. We're going to go ahead and print this. We're going to the hold. That looks good. We'll go under setup. We just need to do a custom size, right? That looks good. Marks and bleed. I don't want any marks on here. I'm not going to need them at all. We're going to be able to put those on when we impose it. And by setting our trim size correctly and having our bleed here, our document is going to hold both the trim size and the bleed size. So I really don't need or want any marks, but I really need to make sure if it's supposed to bleed, I have my bleed here. If I go back to setup, you can see under custom size, it took my 8.5 inches, which is my trim, and it added a 1/4 inch, 1/8 of an inch bleed here, 1/8 of an inch bleed here. So our custom should really just be our bleed size. That's what we really want. We can go ahead and hit print here. Gonna give me some errors. That's okay for what we're doing here. That's gonna send over, and now if we head over and look at the versifier, we can see here's the document that we just sent over. So I'm gonna select this, right click on it, and we want to impose this document. We need to impose something before we set any properties to it. So we're gonna impose, and it's going to show me both pages. You can see down here in the bottom, it's kind of chugging along. It's thinking about building the thumbnails for me, and I really just like to wait till that's done. You can do some of this stuff through your properties, but doing the impose, it gives you a visual, which I just find super helpful. However it looks on screen is how it's going to come out on press. So I think it just makes it a little bit easier to play with some of the options. So as we look at our impose, we're really just going to start at the top and do some key settings, but the rest is going to be a little fair amount of exploration and playing with it to get it to impose the way you need it to for that specific job. So under normal, you can see we really just have two options. A booklet will be literally if you're making a book, and then gang up. So I'm going to choose gang up. And once I've done that, it's kind of made some specific options for gang up. So now it's going to say, well, gang up unique. How do you want to put those together? So I know it's hard to see here because we're on like an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. But here's page 1 and here's page 2. It's saying I'm going to print each page just one time. That's not very helpful for this type of imposition. What we really want to say is repeat, right? So now I have the front page here twice, and then the back page here twice, right? So that lines up. The finish size is based on either your crop box, user defined, or trim. They're all really going to get you to the same place, but based on the selection you're choosing, it's going to change some of your properties underneath. So crop box and user define are pretty similar. A lot of times I go to user defined. You can get to the same place going off crop box. Again, it's not that important that we're all doing the same thing. It's that we get to the same end goal, and you can do that through either of those options. We're going to fix our sheet size now so it looks a little bit more correct. Our sheet size is whatever we're running on press. So if we're running a 12 by 18, we're going to go ahead and grab that, and that's going to start to get things looking a little bit closer. So there's our 12 by 18 sheet, but things still aren't fitting on there quite right. We're going to skip over and do the orientation. So if we go to landscape, there we go. Now it's starting to come together a little bit, that we can see that we're doing 2 up here, right? And that it's actually fitting on the page at this point. And we can see here's page 1, and if we scroll over, we can see there's page 2. Wonderful. So at this point, I typically kind of jump this middle section and come down to my marks. I really care about my marks. So we didn't want to put them in when we printed from InDesign, but we definitely need marks on the page. So when we're back at the cutter, we can figure this out. So we're going to define our marks, and we're going to say print trim marks, right? And you have some options here. One of those options being the offset. So by default, it's going to place those marks right at the edge of our bleed, which is fine if it's a bleeding document. If it is a non-bleed document, it's going to place those right on trim, which makes it incredibly difficult to trim it without seeing those little marks. So it's not a bad habit to get into, to just start putting 1/4 inch here. Even if it's a bleed, it's not going to hurt it, but it's definitely going to help you out down the road. So I'm going to go ahead and okay that, and you can see that it puts our marks, and you can see the offset there as well. There's a little bit of white space in between the two. Just lost my marks there, sorry. Go ahead and turn that back on. 0.125, 0.125, awesome. Right, so at this point we're looking pretty good. Now the way this document is set up and the way it was designed, I can run this really without having to worry about a gutter in between, right? That burgundy goes the whole way across, that tan goes the whole way across, and that's true for the front and the back. So if this was a production job, I would go ahead and save this, because now I just have 1, 2, 3, 4 cuts around the outside, and I have 1 cut down the middle, and my job is finished. That would be different though if this was a photograph in the background, right, where that the photograph switches right down the middle from the left and the right page. I'm not going to be able to trim that down the middle, and I'd really need to have bleed in between those two. So that's going to be our gutter, and we can go into define, and we could say, hey, we need a 1/4 inch in between. That would give us 1/8 for this side, 1/8 for this side. And if I okay that, and once it updates, you can see we now have room for bleed in between those two pages, which is going to be really important, again, if your image is bleeding, but it's not a clean, flat color in between those two pages. The majority of times, you really do need to put a gutter in between there. Now this document is 8.5 by 11, but if I was doing something smaller, like business cards, this rows and columns would be extremely helpful. I could go ahead and put 4 rows across and 10 rows down, and I could really fill that entire page. So this sample is relatively small, but you can really go further with our gang up imposition. At this point, we are ready to get out of the imposition and back into just our straight up command workstation. So I'm going to do File, Save, and it's going to save it into the held queue here. And you can see it's holding the same name, except it says -imp. Go ahead and okay that. All right, it's going to flatten our job out. And at that point, I can go ahead and close this. So here's my original job, and you can see the paper size is at letter. Here's our impose job that we just did. The user has changed, and our paper size has changed as well. So now I would be ready to double click it, go into properties, make my settings, and do a proof print. And that's gonna allow me to see how it's backing up before I start that job. But that is our imposition as far as a gang up imposition.